Well, welcome everybody. Nice to see you all. And our session today, we're going to begin. Maybe we'll get through all of it, but I doubt it. I'm talking about Rabbi Akiva, one of the great early rabbis, and it's actually a very suitable time to be studying about Rabbi Akiva, because at the moment, I'll try and put this away, looking at it straight up. Next week is Lag BaOmer. So we have this whole period of the Omer that we're in, and there's a tradition that to this day, right, 2,000 years later, during this whole period of the calendar between Passover and Shavuot, really observant people don't cut their hair, don't shave, and you don't have any weddings, right? There's no Jewish weddings during this period.
It's like 40 days, isn't
It's
it?
like, well, it depends. The whole period is 49 because it's between Passover and Shavuot, but there's some days. And so why is it this period of semi-mourning? Because the students of Rabbi Akiva were mean to each other and not kind to each other, and so plague. Rabbi Akiva, and supposedly the plague stopped on Lag BaOmer, which is next week. That's when a lot of people have weddings or cut their hair on that day, and that's where you have the big celebrations, the ultra-Orthodox Woodstock. 1 million people end up there, and it ended in tragedy a few years ago with the disaster in Iran. So it's a good time to be studying about Rabbi Akiva. And so myself, when I was growing up, my father, I guess, loved Rabbi Akiva because I heard about Rabbi Akiva all the time. But Rabbi Akiva is, in some ways, one of the most important rabbis for the conservative movement. Big innovators, willing to change things. A lot of conservative Judaism is all about, okay, we're conserving Judaism, but we're willing to change things. And like the Orthodox, who don't want to change anything, and that's how the conservative rabbis saw themselves, right? I remember I was once doing a whole week-long interfaith training with Muslims and Christians, and there was a leader of every religion who had to spend an hour introducing the whole religion in 1 hour, like everybody else. And so the head of the program Judaism to the Christians and Muslims, and one of the things that there's some sound coming from somewhere. I'm not sure where it is, but if it comes again, I'll have to mute out the screen. Anyhow, yeah, the feedback I think might be coming from Bonnie. So let me try. Let's see. I'm going to mute you for now, Bonnie. Okay. So when they were teaching about Judaism, they taught 2 texts to the class as part of that 1 hour. And one of the texts was this Midrash about Rabbi Akiva. And we're going to study the Midrash, but the thing is, but what it's about, it's Moses is on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and he's receiving the Torah, and God tells him at some point somebody's going to be interpreting every crown on every letter in the Torah scroll. And Moses says, really? Show me this. I can't believe this. So God takes Moses 1,000 years into the future, and he's sitting at the back of the study hall, and there's Rabbi Akiva talking about how every little letter on top of the Torah has a meaning, and Rabbi Akiva is interpreting the Torah in all the complex ways he does. And Moses doesn't understand a word he's saying. And he's like, what is going on here? And then so God says, well, then Rabbi Akiva says, well, this is Torah that was taught to Moses on Sinai. And that makes Moses feel a little bit better, because even though he doesn't understand it, and it's not really what he taught at Mount Sinai, I guess he says, well, at least he's still mentioning my name. And so this is Rabbi Akiva, who took the Torah and reinterpreted it so much that he basically changed Judaism very much. Because before, right, Judaism was the religion of the temple, of sacrifices, and Rabbi Akiva, he just changed everything. But he gave Judaism what it needed to survive to this day.
Century?
This is in the 2nd century. So, Rabbi Akiva was born in 95 CE of the Common Era and died in 135. So he was young,
He was
right?
only 40, right?
No, this can't be, because they say he was, oh, so these dates I have here can't be right.
Okay,
Yeah,
he was older.
he was much older. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure why it says FL. Anyhow, well, I'll
The
look that up.
second century.
But he was most active in the 2nd century. And his stories are all very interesting. So I always thought of Rabbi Akiva as being one of the most important rabbis. A short story, but when I was in rabbinical school, it was March, and this is what happens in rabbinical school. 2 of my rabbinical school classmates wanted to do a March Madness bracket, but with rabbis, and have rabbis compete against each other. Then so the March Madness was that you'd have one bracket on the left hand was all the rabbis of ancient times all against each other, and they do a little radio show to do the competition between different rabbis. And on the other side was all the rabbis of modern times, and then to see who's the greatest rabbi of all time. This is where rabbinical students get up to, right? And I was scandalized that Rabbi Akiva did not even make it into their bracket. So I put up a vivid defense, and that I thought it was down to their lack of knowledge more than anything. So this is what we got up to. We'll see how his stories really embody a lot of what are the values of the early rabbis, and they're really interesting to study. So we're going to begin. I saw somebody put in the chat year 50. Okay, good.
That makes him 85 at death, which
That's
makes
better. That's better, because the 95 here just doesn't make any sense. Yeah, you might as well. They've got enough of them. Okay. Does everybody have it online, the document?
No.
It was sent with an email that was sent last night.
I was
Okay.
able to get it and access it. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have it? Anybody else not have
I
it?
got it. I got it.
All
I
right.
have,
7:00 last night, yeah.
It was sent from the synagogue, Bill. All right. We're going to start and read number 140, and this is that famous Midrash that I was talking about, that in the interfaith setting. This is probably one of the 2 most important texts in justifying conservative Judaism on some level. Would someone like to read this number 140?
I will.
Okay.
Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One affixing crowns to letters. Moses asked, Lord of the universe, why use crowns to intimate what you wish? Who hinders your hand from writing out in full all of the Torah's precepts?
Right. So he's saying, why you have to put these crowns as hints of special things to learn? Why don't you just write it out, what it's all about? Okay.
Who hinders your hand from writing blah, blah, blah? God replied, at the end of many generations, there will arise a man, Akiva ben Joseph by name, who will infer heaps and heaps of laws from each title on these crowns. Lord of the universe, said Moses, permit me to see him. God replied, turn around. Moses went and sat down behind 8 rows of Rabbi Akiva's disciples and listened to their discourses on law. Not being able to follow what they were saying, he was so distressed that he grew faint. But when they came to a certain subject and the disciples asked Rabbi Akiva, Master, where did you learn this? And Rabbi Akiva replied, it is a law given to Moses at Sinai. Moses was reassured. He returned to the Holy One and said, Lord of the universe, you have such a man, yet you give the Torah just by his hand, not by mine. God replied, be silent, thus has it come to my mind. Then Moses said, Lord of the universe, you have shown me his Torah, now show me his reward. Turn around, said God. Moses turned around and saw Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed out in a meat market. Lord of the universe, Moses cried out in protest, such Torah and such is its reward? God replied, be silent. Thus has it come to my mind. Whoa.
So a very interesting and complex Midrash, right? Story about in the last part, which not,
Yeah.
and so right, Rabbi Akiva died a martyr's, a horrible death, right? We remember Yom Kippur, we always read about Rabbi Akiva, where the Romans tortured him to death.
And he said the Shema.
And he said
right?
the Shema, just as he was dying, exactly.
But that's such a horrible thing of saying his flesh being weighed out in a
I
meat
know, it's
market.
like, but that's
Is that
how
the
horrible.
reference to the?
Yeah, so it's a reference to how he died,
how he
because yeah,
died.
he had one of the worst kinds of
Yeah, that was
torture the
horrible.
Romans did. It's very interesting portrayal of Moses, of God, and of Rabbi Akiva, of the whole thing, right? So anybody have any comments about this Midrash? I mean, how does it portray Rabbi Akiva to you? What do you come out thinking of Rabbi Akiva about this?
Well, one question I have is I'm confused about his age, because I read that he didn't start learning until he was 40.
Yes.
And
Right.
then it says, in reading down here, it said then he led the Jews for 40 years.
That's like
So
he's 120.
Make him
So-
80.
Well, I
That would
think,
make him 80.
Well,
Well-
it says 40, 40, and 40.
so we'll get to that in a second. So what's it saying? Who lived to 120?
Moses.
Moses, right? So that's a way of comparing Moses, because Moses was the same. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and 40 years leading the Jewish people across the desert. What it's saying, both of these are comparing Akiva to Moses, which is a pretty bold comparison, right? Because Moses is the greatest prophet of all time. There were none like Moses. And it's this whole Midrash is a little bit disrespectful to Moses, right? Because Moses, first of all, doesn't understand what's going on. And he asks meekly, God, permit me to see this great man who's inferring all of this.
It's like they were using artificial intelligence at that.
Well, that's what it feels like, right? That the technology is so much more evolved. He's way caught in the past. And so Akiva in some ways embodies the fact, right, that the rabbis knew that what they were doing was very different than what their ancestors were doing, right? They used to have a Torah, everything was in the Torah, you followed the laws that were in the Torah. But what the rabbis of Rabbi Akiva's generation were doing, they were reinterpreting it in such a way that there really was very little link to what the original Torah was. They said, okay, this law that we're doing is linked to the Torah, but was it really? It doesn't say in the Torah to light candles. They made it up, right? It doesn't say in the Torah, all the laws of Shabbat. It just says in the Torah, you shall keep Shabbat. It doesn't tell you what to do, but the rabbis really made it all up, right? Or maybe there was some stuff that was handed down generation to generation, but Rabbi Akiva was so creative, and because he knew that Judaism had to evolve to survive, right? So he allowed himself, but he couldn't just say, I'm inventing this, because then people would say, what's this new religion you're creating? He was saying I'm inferring this law from the crown on this letter in the Torah. So Akiva was trying to tie everything back to the Torah itself, because he wanted to always create a link with the past. So Rabbi Akiva was the one in some ways who created much of the religion that we're living today. I mean, he created it 2,000 years ago, but he was a complete innovator. And so there's Moses, who embodies the law and the Torah, growing faint, hearing what they're talking about, because he doesn't understand what they're talking about. He said, this is the Judaism that I brought down from Mount Sinai. So it's a recognition that the Judaism that the rabbis were creating was very different than the Judaism that Moses was bringing down from Mount Sinai. And their view of God is also a little bit chutzpahdik, right? Because right here's God's voice. God is very stern on some level. And Moses, what does Moses say? You have this man who's so smart. Why did you give the Torah to me? I mean, what a thing to put in Moses's. And what does God say? God says, I'm not going to explain why this is happening, right? God is silent in the face of this, which is, God says, you be silent. And then Moses saying, well, you have such a smart man that he was able to, create so much from my laws. What was his reward? He was killed.
Yeah, I mean, that
And then-
seems so strange. Show me his.
Punishment, not a
Yeah,
reward.
for punishment, right?
Right. So what he's saying is, this is the rabbis who are, in some ways, their anger at God, right? The early rabbis had this very complex relationship with God because, they felt they were trying to, pick Judaism up from the destruction of the temple, from the exile, from all the horrible things that were happening to Jews then, and then happened during 2,000 years of exile. And they didn't quite know, God, where are you throughout all of this, right? Where is God throughout everything happening? And so you can sense their own sense of, okay, God, here we are trying to save your Judaism. What's our reward?
Well, how do rabbis today explain that?
Well, we wrestle with it.
I bet.
Well, can't you think of the Torah itself as like a poem, for example? It's written, but it has a lot of depth to it. So there are many, many levels of the thing. And Moses writes the surface of it, not particularly paying attention to or even being interested in the depth because he assumes that the depth comes with the surface. Akiva goes into the depth of the thing and in fact doesn't create new things, but finds new things in the depth of the Torah itself. And I think one of the pieces in the handout gives us some clues as to that process.
Yeah, the beautiful story of Rabbi Akiva ascending to the divine orchard, to the Pardes. Yeah, so it is, and that's what Rabbi Akiva felt he was doing. He was maybe we can say that at the time of Moses, the people, according to the Torah, heard God's voice. It was all alive for them, Judaism, and then everything didn't need to be written out. But Rabbi Akiva, he just went deeply into the Torah and was trying to gather more and learn more and bring it out for people, so people could understand new depths and people could experience it in new ways. And he was both an intellectual genius and also a spiritual genius, we say from that.
That was his reward also for teaching people.
So I mean, he was right. He taught. Why was he killed? And we'll get to it because the Romans said anybody who teaches will be put to death. And he said, I don't care. I'm going to teach anyway. So he was he embodied that ideal of teaching Torah was teaching Torah to the people and nonstop, without end, revealing secrets, talking about the hidden depths of the Torah. He just felt that Jews needed that, and that was his life mission, and he was not going to stop doing that despite despite any dangers to himself. And so it's he in some ways one of the first real martyrs of the exile period, right? He's the one who started this process, right? So for thousands of years, Jews have died instead of, betraying the Torah, so to speak, right? And so, I mean, we read about Rabbi Akiva in the same breath as the Jews who died in the Holocaust, right? So it's the same idea that during the exile, the long years of exile, Jews faced very, very big tribulations and were challenged to give up their faith. And he represents that part of a tradition which says, I'd rather die than give up our faith. And so it's very, 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 very interesting. And this text which is a very loaded text, right, represents some of the rabbis' anguish and kind of the challenge to God, right? Through thousands of years, Jews have said, "Hey, God, why are you choosing us so much? Why is this happening to us? Why can't we also have why is this our reward for trying to keep teaching your Torah?"
It's interesting because the Jews have a completely different fate than, say, Socrates. So it said that Socrates died so that a philosopher doesn't ever again have to die for the city. So in some sense, Socrates dies, and philosophers learn that they have to keep their mouths shut, or they have to talk in a way in which it's sort of hidden what they're actually saying. The Jews never learned that. They seem to talk out loud about these things.
Well, the Jews after Rabbi Akiva's death and the putting down the Bar Kokhba revolt, on some level they did, because they said, well, now the law of the land is the law, so we're going to follow. We're going to do our best on one level to keep ourselves underground, even though we're not going to give up. But you're right, we're not going to give up what the Romans were saying, which is teaching Torah and circumcising and all of the things that was. So right, that's when the rabbis instituted, on pain of death, there's only 3 things that you can't. Better to. So if someone tells you eat pork or die, eat the pork. It doesn't matter. But if someone said, but there are 3 things that you don't do, you'd better to die. So and those are sexual immorality, idolatry, and murder. So, so the Jews, we've been living in that tension for a long time, but there have been many moments where the Jews refused to convert, right, and during the Crusades and died in masses, and other times, and it's part of our story. On the other hand, we live in a slightly different period, because Jews have experienced a renaissance both in America and in Israel over the last 70, 80 years. So we, thank God, don't live in that tension quite as much as Jews did during other periods. But go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I a question about the text.
Yes.
You had said that you asked what we could learn about Rabbi Akiva, but in a certain sense from the text, but in a certain sense, of course it tells us more about Rabbi Judah, about whom I know actually nothing, because it's about his or whoever in his name, at least it's stated that this amazing and very troubling story. But right in the middle of it, where God says to Moses, where Rabbi Akiva to his class says, it is a law given to Moses at Sinai. I don't have it in front of me, the text from the Talmud, but I've heard it referred to as the law given by Moses. Is there an ambiguity about the text? If you happen to remember, or I went to look for it in Sefaria, but I haven't found it yet, and I wanted to hear what you were saying, so I hadn't gotten far.
It is. It's a whole category of law, and actually, it's funny because it's whenever the halakha says this, and it's actually important to know this. It's a law for which there is no source. That's the truth. Whenever halakhically you say this is a law that was handed down, given to Moses at Sinai, it's a halakha for which you have really no source. So it's one in which you just have to trust the rabbis.
Oh, so it does say given to Moses, but and the understanding of that is you won't find support.
It's an oral law.
It's the oral law. Okay.
It's an oral law, but it's an oral law for which you have no inference. So there's some.
Okay. That's very helpful.
So when you study, for example, the laws of tefillin, tefillin has all these laws, a whole multitude of laws, and some of them are laws that were given that there's no source from them, and some of them, some laws. So when a lot of the Talmud is this, right? A lot of the Talmud is, okay, we have a whole section across the Talmud. So we have this law of, for example, the tefillin has to be, let's say, colored all in black. And if you have any part of the tefillin that's not in black, you can't, it's not a kosher tefillin. So this is why, when you have tefillin and the part of it's not black anymore, you have to paint it straight away, or your whole tefillin is not. But where do you learn that from? So, where do you learn stuff like that? And there's thousands and thousands of laws that are like that, because you look in the Torah, it has nothing, it doesn't say anything. So then the rabbis have all these tools to try and find it to a verse. So I'm trying to think of one now. So a lot of, for example, a better example, the laws of saying, this is the law you can relate to, the laws of blessing food before and blessing food after, right? We bless food before and we bless food after, right? So the blessing, and the fact that you have to bless food after, that's easy, because it says in the book of Deuteronomy, after you've eaten your fill, you shall bless. So that's directly in the Torah. But where do you learn the law to bless food before you eat? And so the rabbis start to say, well, can you infer it from that one place where it says that you bless afterwards? Does that mean, of course, you have to bless before? And then they say, well, we learn, then they'll pull out another verse that will say somewhere else in the Torah, anything that's before is also afterwards, But then they'll say, wait a second, no, from that verse, we actually learned a different law. And we have a rule, you can only learn 2 laws for every verse in the Torah. And then they think, well, can I then take that lesson from that and fix it to a different verse and then relearn it from that one? And so they're completely playing around all the time with how to find a justification for any of their laws back in the Torah. And they have certain sets of rules which they try to limit themselves, because if it's without limit, then there's no rules to their game, so to speak. But Rabbi Akiva is one of the great innovators who created a completely different thing. For example, it's called Kal Vachomer. So if, for example, if there's something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, Yom Kippur, which is called the Shabbat of all Shabbats, all the more so it's forbidden on Shabbat, because Shabbat is even more hefty than Shabbat, right? So it's called, Kal is the simple example, and Chomer is the more heavy example. So anything that you learn from a simple situation, all the more so from a
Are you talking to me? Siéntate, yo estoy organizando papeles.
Okay, well, I'm just going to mute.
Relax.
Okay, so these are all these rules that the early rabbis put together to try and justify all, not just to justify, but to learn how do we live this Judaism that they were in the process of innovating, while also keeping connected to the Torah. Everything starts with the Torah, but then you can tell
A lot of what you were talking about too could be thought of as building a fence around the Torah. The notion of extending the law, like before and after. If the law goes this far, well, we have to make sure that we don't cross that point. So we better make a law. We better increment the law so that it begins to take place at a nearer point to the thing, something like that. And that's also a common thing that you find. Like, for example, all the stuff about Passover, that you can't eat. I don't know if you can eat rice, but because rice maybe looks like bread, you couldn't eat rice. But there are lots of things like that.
It's true. There were 2 things they were doing. One is they wanted to make sure that they would be able to not infringe anything in the Torah, so they built fences. So they say, we know, you could look at it that way too. We want to make sure that we're blessing correctly, So let's not just bless once, let's bless before and after and all around kind of thing, you know. So that's the way the rabbis do that in many places. But it's also more than that. There's all these stories of rabbis in this early period who were, you know, they were innovating, you know, they were walking on the beach all day thinking, what is the blessing for seeing the ocean? And then one rabbi would say, well, this is the blessing. And then another rabbi would say, no, this is the blessing. And then their students would kind of fight it out. And eventually the custom that most people liked, they would follow. So there was also this sense of trying to innovate and figure out, well, how do you live a Judaism when you don't have a temple anymore? How do you live a Judaism when you're no longer living in your land? And so they were innovators too, right? And so you have all these stories of like, so one rabbi would say, well, I'm going to start to do this blessing at the end of Shabbat called Havdalah. And so some rabbis would do first the wine and then the spices and then the fire, and the others would do the fire, the spices, and the wine. And it would be like, well, Rabbi, why are you doing this version? And they would say, well, because it says in the Torah, blah, blah, blah. And then they would say, well, I have another verse in the Torah that says blah, blah, blah. And so, part of it was the beauty of discussing everything also keeps your mind off all the terrible tragedy around you.
Oh, and they like to argue.
And they like to argue, right? So part of it was all this back and forth and all around and filling every moment of your life with argument and debate. And also ritual takes your mind away from the fact that the temple is destroyed and your people are being persecuted and there's no temple. And so it's all, but
the arguments aren't only distraction. The arguments, because they're mostly dialectical arguments, actually go to a place. They sort of open you up internally if they're done properly. So they're a distraction, but they're also set to climb a ladder to somewhere.
They were a spiritual practice, and it was the rabbi's spiritual practice of study, and part of it was sharpening the mind, and part of it was they had tremendous devotion, and they felt it was their way of figuring God's will, because they felt in ancient times there were prophets who came and said, God says, do not do this, do not do that. So when that happens, you know what God wants, because the prophet is telling you directly, I hear God's voice in my mind. So the rabbis, they didn't feel they heard God's voice, and they were upset about that. But what they had was the Torah, and they felt I can go look in the Torah and try and infer God's voice, and give ourselves the authority. But they were doing that, but as we'll see, or we're going to see this with other figures even more, they were also in this really interesting place where, so the temple's destroyed. The first generation is mourning and mourning and mourning and in shock. But then there's also the early Christians around, and there's the people who are just living in the desert and saying, it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world. And there's the people who are saying, let's just live like the Greeks and forget about Judaism. And everybody was fighting between them to kind of gather the people and to lead the people. And so the rabbis were trying to lead the people and give themselves the authority and say, we're the ones who are in charge. And not only that, but there were also people who are saying, okay, why should we follow you rabbis? And why should we follow you specific rabbi? And there were some rabbis who had lineage and who had, we are the sons of these great figures. And there were other rabbis who were saying, follow me instead of following them. And so they were trying to create an effective system, but it was, this village would do this and this village, they had the Sanhedrin. We don't know exactly what that was, but that was a group of rabbis who were, trying to delineate the law. But it was all very messy, and after the destruction of the temple, they lost a lot of their authority. So a lot of it was the rabbis trying to build their authority. These rabbis, as we'll see, it's not like some of them were wealthy because they came from wealthy families, but they didn't have congregations that charged dues that paid them. So a lot of them were also, blacksmiths or, had other jobs, and they were devoted to Torah. And it was both a beautiful time and a challenging time and a very interesting time. And they were creating everything as they were going along a lot of the time. So it was a time of innovation. let's read a few more, and then we'll get to the story of Rabbi Akiva and where he comes from. So, who is reading? I forgot.
Me,
Okay, Norma, if you don't mind reading 141 and 142 too.
Rabbi Akiva was a shepherd 40 years. He studied Torah 40 years. He guided Israel 40 years.
And the next one too.
Who are the fathers of the world? Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva.
The Rabbi Ishmael is the one who created the principles for deducing all of these laws from Torah, the principles of Rabbi Ishmael. So that's probably why they're saying he's the father of the world. And if you don't mind reading 143 too.
Had Shaphan not arisen in his time, and Ezra in his time, and Rabbi Akiva in his time, would not the Torah have been forgotten in Israel?
So
that's
it's
interesting.
so these are all little verses saying how great Rabbi Akiva was for this work that he did of reinterpreting the crowns, right? So who was Ezra? Ezra is the one who with Nehemiah came back from Babylon after the destruction of the first temple and instituted the reading of the Torah and created a whole tradition of studying Torah in some ways. And who was Shaphan? Shaphan was the scribe at the time of the book of Kings who found the scroll that people believe is the book of Deuteronomy, and who kind of came to a revival of Torah in that time. So they're saying that Rabbi Akiva is the one who made the Torah accessible to the masses, right? Who made it alive, who brought life to it, who taught it, who made it real. So now let's get to 145, which is the story, and 146, the story where Rabbi Akiva comes from. Somebody like to read for us?
Rabbi Akiva worked as a shepherd for Kalba Savua. When Rachel, Kalba Savua's daughter, saw that even though Akiva was unassuming, there was something extraordinary about him, she said, "If I am willing to be betrothed to you, will you attend a house of study?" Rabbi Akiva answered, "Yes." So she betrothed herself to him in secret. When Kalba Savua learned what she had done, he drove her out of his house and vowed that she was not to benefit from any of his property. At that, she went off and openly married Akiva. When winter came, they were so poor that they had to sleep in a straw bin. As Rabbi Akiva picked the straw from her hair, he would say, "If I had the means, I would give you a Jerusalem of gold." Presently, the prophet Elijah, disguised as a mortal, came and cried out at their door, "Please give me a bit of straw. My wife is about to give birth, and I have nothing for her to lie on." Rabbi Akiva said to his wife, "Look at this man. He does not even have the straw that we have." Soon after, she insisted, "Go now and learn the Torah in a house of study." He went away, and for 12 years, he sat in a house of study in the presence of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. At the end of 12 years, he arose and returned to his home, bringing with him 12,000 disciples. Everyone went out to meet him. When his wife heard of his arrival, she too went out to meet him. But her neighbor said to her, "Borrow some clothes, put them on, make yourself presentable." But she replied, "A righteous man will recognize his loyal creature," Proverbs 12:10. When she came near him, she fell upon her face and was about to kiss his feet, but his disciples sought to push her aside. Rabbi Akiva shouted at them, "Let her be. Mine and yours are rightly hers." Her father, on hearing that a great man had come to town, said, "I shall go to him, and perhaps the great man will release me of my vow." When the father came to him, Rabbi Akiva asked, "Would you have made your vow if you had known that her husband was to become a great man?" And the father replied, "Had her husband known even one chapter, even one halakha, I would not have made such a vow." Rabbi Akiva then said, "I am your daughter's husband." And the father fell upon his face and kissed Rabbi Akiva's feet, and presently he gave him half of his wealth.
Has anything ever been said about the fact that if his wife, who was obviously very astute and saw things that others didn't, hadn't done that, would he have been?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, she's the hero, right? In
Yes.
this story.
Very much so. Very much so. And the way the 12,000 male disciples treat her, right? Because all they see is a woman in rags. They don't see the great Rachel, right? They don't see the great wife Rachel.
Mhm,
Very nice.
mhm. But what's nice is the Rabbi Akiva, he stands up for her, right? And he recognizes her greatness, and I mean, the whole story of the prophet Elijah coming is interesting, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but I think it's about I think it's to say that that God wanted Rabbi Akiva to be able to have a little bit of dignity to his wife by saying, look, we are not the poorest people in the entire world. Someone else is a little bit poorer. Or it might be that Rabbi Akiva then ended up giving him his straw. I don't know.
That's where the expression there, but for the grace of God.
Yeah,
relies,
really. Coming at this moment to raise you up a little bit.
Mhm.
But a sense of the amount of work that went into what he did, right? He studied for 12 years is a long time, right? Full time, not seeing the sacrifice, the sense of sacrifice of Rabbi Akiva. And I think we find in a lot of these stories a sense of how the rabbis also saw the whole rabbinic endeavor of what everything the rabbis were trying to accomplish, right? The sacrifices to their family life, the sacrifices, to create this and to study everything they were trying to study. And the greatness, right? And whenever I think of this story, I think of 2,000 years of rabbis marrying. Often it was that the scholars would marry the wealthy merchant's daughter, right? In the throughout history, because that was the you pair so this is kind of what happened here, and it was saying what is it saying? It's saying the most important thing is Torah study, right? That's what the story is saying, and that's what the rabbis wanted to into the Jewish consciousness, right? That the most important thing is to be learned, and so he should give him all his wealth, because that's what's really important. And the
women are the hidden force behind this, the secret sauce, that without that nothing happens.
Exactly.
It's striking to me that even if you try to strip away legendary elements, but however you look at the story, even if it shows that the woman is denied her husband, whom she presumably wanted to be with for 12 years. And that part of the story isn't, maybe, I can't recall if there's a later story that picks up on that fact. It seems to me there is, but here, at any rate, here she's a young woman, and 12 years, her husband is at her, in fact, invitation, has gone off to study. What do the rabbis make of that? And I think there's another 12 years later.
Well, there is another 12 years later, but there's quite a few places where the old stories of the rabbis talk about the pain of right. There's the famous story. There's a story that was quoted by a female Talmud scholar in the Knesset, and even made some of the ultra-Orthodox men, give her a little respect. But she quoted a story about this woman who's waiting every Yom Kippur for her husband to come back at least one day a year to be with her, from this house of study. And then one day, even on Yom Kippur, he doesn't come back, and she falls off dead from the roof of the house. But it was they knew that there was this mode, the spiritual mode that they were encouraging was not good for it. But look, it still exists in the Orthodox world,
I was
right?
just gonna say
It's
that.
not so different, right? Not so different. But somehow this idea of study became the center point of Judaism, and there was the rabbi. They acknowledge within the text the good and the bad of it, right? So they try and glorify it. But we'll see. Akiva, it's complicated.
In a way, we're not any different than the priests who dedicate that, to a person who just goes to the yeshiva and studies and doesn't have a life.
It's true. Well, the rabbis do their best to try and, in many places, tell, force in halacha the males to listen to their wives and to be there for their wives in all kinds of ways, take care of their wives, and to, there shouldn't be, they shouldn't take it, to the utmost, because the whole culture that this creates easily creates a culture where women are just seen as supporting the men's kind of scholarly glory, and so there's a lot of places to try and balance it with various degrees of success. But it's it creates, for sure, it creates hardship. And there's a story I was not going to study. You can learn later on in this packet where it talks about how Rabbi Akiva himself was, would only come home early on 2 days a year. He had his side too, where he was at home too much. He wasn't home very much, and he spent too much time, studying and with his students and not taking care of his family. And there's a whole passage where his son is dying and he doesn't come to visit his son. And so it was complicated. There was this, it was complicated. But let's read the next one, because the next one's really important too. Nancy, do you want to read the next one too? 146.
Okay, hold on, let me get 146. Okay, what were Akiva's beginnings? It is said, up to the age of 40, he had not yet studied a thing. One time, while standing by the mouth of a well in Lida, he inquired, who hollowed out this stone? And was told, Akiva, haven't you read in scripture that water wears away stone? Job 14:19. It was water from the well falling upon it constantly, day after day. At that, Rabbi Akiva asked himself, is my mind harder than this stone? I will go and study at least one section of Torah. He went directly to a schoolhouse, and he and his son began reading from a child's tablet. Rabbi Akiva took hold of one end of the tablet and his son the other end. The teacher wrote down Aleph and Bet for him, and he learned them. Aleph to Tav, and he learned them. The book of Leviticus, and he learned it. He went on studying until he learned the whole Torah. Then he went and sat before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. My masters, he said to them, reveal the sense of Mishnah to me. When they told him one halakha, he went off to reason with himself. This Aleph, he wondered, what was that written? What was it written for? That Bet, what was it written for? This teaching, what was it uttered for? He kept coming back, kept inquiring of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua until he reduced his teachers to silence. All the 12 years that Rabbi Akiva was with Rabbi Eliezer paid little attention to him, so that when Rabbi Akiva offered his first clinching argument to him, Rabbi Joshua quoted the verse, there is the army you paid no attention to. Now go out and fight it. Judges 9:38. Rabbi Simeon ben Eliezer said, I shall tell you a parable to illustrate what Rabbi Akiva did. He was like a stone cutter, hacking away at mountains. One time he took his pickaxe in his hand, went and sat on top of the mountain and began to chip small stones from it. Some men came by and asked him, what are you doing? I mean to uproot the mountain and cast it into the Jordan. Can you possibly do such a thing? Yes. He continued hacking away until he came to a big boulder. He placed an iron claw under it, pried it loose, uprooted it, and cast it into the Jordan. Then he espied another, even bigger boulder, placed an iron claw under it, and cast it into the Jordan, saying, your place is not here, but there. Rabbi Akiva had to perform such uprooting of big boulders with the instruction of Rabbi Eliezer and Joshua. In keeping with the verse, he falls to work upon the flinty rocks. He turns mountains up by the roots. He carves out channels through rock, and his eye beholds every precious thing. Job 28:9-10. Each day, Rabbi Akiva would gather a bundle of twigs. Half of it he would sell to provide food for himself, and the other half he would use for his personal needs. His neighbors rose up in protest, saying, Akiva, you are all but choking us with smoke. Sell us the twigs, buy oil with the money, and study by the light of a lamp. He replied, I find many uses for the twigs. To begin with, I study by the light they give. Then I keep warm by their heat. And finally, I sleep on some of them. That doesn't sound like he's evolved from straw at all.
He's thrifty.
It is said, before Rabbi Akiva departed from the world, he owned tables made of silver and gold. He even ascended his couch by a stepladder made of gold. His wife used to go out shod with golden sandals and wearing a golden tiara. That this all sounds like gross exaggeration. Master, his disciples said to him, you put us to shame before our wives by what you are doing for her. He replied, much suffering did she endure with me for the sake of Torah.
A beautiful story, right? It's one of the, just a great story about it. Rabbi Akiva's perseverance, and to some degree, it's a symbol for all the work that all the rabbis did over 500 years, to create the Talmud and the rabbinic tradition. And
he's tunneling into rock too. And, and rock is one of the names of God, actually. So he's sort of looking into the mystery of our being. He's looking into everything, and he's tunneling, all this tunneling into rock. And I think that's what his logic is, where his logic is taking him, where his dialectic is taking him, is right through the rock, into the rock.
And it's interesting because once you make a tunnel or a channel, other people can walk through that tunnel or channel, and that's kind of what was his big thing. He did all this, and it's also an incredible story of hope, right? That in some ways the greatest rabbi started at 40 years old, right? That says that the rabbis will say the Torah is the inheritance of every Jew. So right, you can start at any age and start to learn Torah, and or of any person really, you can start at any age and start to study and can become you can do anything, right? And this is an amazing story of perseverance, and of taking on that spiritual and intellectual path that we're talking about.
But how does the riches go with the humble self?
I know. What do you think about it?
I mean, it's like a few paragraphs back, it said the father gave her means.
Yeah, half the means.
That's
Yeah,
where, he got the money, but it just seemed a little ostentatious.
it became a little
Well,
ostentatious.
but I don't think he's actually talking about gold that he's wearing. The path through the rock actually turns out to have some kind of a golden trace to it. In alchemy, for example, which is sort of a debased study these days, but if you look at it, in alchemy, what you're trying to do is you're trying to change your passions in such a way that they become golden. The gold of the philosopher's stone, the gold of changing the passions, it has to do with getting into the rock. I mean, that's the way I see it anyway.
Well, it could be that that's part of the imagery too, but it's also there's actually a lot of talk between all these rabbis about those who had the wealth and those who didn't have the wealth, and because some did and some had nothing. And I mean, it's interesting though, because Judaism is the rabbis who were. There were rabbis who were very poor and very great, and there were rabbis who were very great and very wealthy. And there you can tell that the rabbis who were poor kind of prod the wealthy ones a little bit, like, hey, it's not fair. But the tradition it's not too judgmental. It's a little bit judgmental of them. I think here it puts this, Rabbi Akiva says, look what she endured for Torah, i.e. she worked hard for this, that's kind of the part of it too. But there's also a sense of there's a mixture of the otherworldly and the thisworldly, and it's all kind of mixed together in general, all of this, which is somewhat unique to the tradition of the rabbis. So we're going to stop here. If you're interested, keep reading. We're going to read more of Rabbi Akiva next week. We're not going to read all of them because there's too many, but we'll get to the second half of his life. If you're interested, read some of the others. They're all great stories of Rabbi Akiva.
Thank you.